He was searching for missing cows, simply following tracks across the desert. But a chance discovery, an old pipe leading underground, revealed what had been hidden from everyone for decades. See where it led and what had been buried under the sand all these years. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching this video from. The morning began with silence, a kind of silence that didn't belong to any ordinary dawn. The wind had died sometime in the night, leaving the valley under a stillness so complete that even the old weather vane on the barn roof stood motionless. Jason Wells stepped out onto his porch and listened. There was nothing, the usual sound of his cattle lowing from the pasture, the clank of a loose gate, even the distant hum of insects, all gone. The only sound that reached him was the brittle crackle of dust shifting under his boots. He stared out across the stretch of cracked earth that had once been a meadow. The sun was just rising over the horizon, pale and sharp, spilling light over the dry fields. The color of the land was no longer gold, but a faint gray-yellow, as though the life had been drained from it. He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the sting of sweat even in the cool hour before heat returned. Something was wrong. He walked toward the barn, calling softly to the herd, expecting an answering stir. The wooden gate to the pen was open, its latch swinging uselessly. Inside the corral, the ground was churned up with hoofprints leading toward the south, down into the hollow where the old riverbed ran. He knelt, tracing the prints with his hand, the dust dry and cool between his fingers. The tracks were fresh, no older than a few hours. He counted at least half his herd gone, 5, maybe 6 head of cattle. He straightened slowly, shading his eyes as he looked toward the distance. The riverbed was nothing more than a ribbon of sand now, snaking through the valley like the scar of a long-healed wound. Jason stood there for a long while before deciding what to do. He didn't have much left in this world, just the land, a few animals, and the old house his father had built. Losing the herd meant losing everything. He went back inside, took a battered canteen from the hook by the door, filled it with what little cool water remained in the pitcher, and slung it over his shoulder. On the table, his father's revolver lay beside an old map, yellowed and curled at the edges. He hesitated, then took both. The gun was heavy and unnecessary, maybe, but it steadied him to carry it. The dog whined as he passed through the gate, but he gave a quick whistle that sent it back under the porch. It was too hot already for company. He started down the faint track that led away from the house, past the line of dead cottonwoods that once marked the property's border. The land opened ahead of him, wide and empty. The sun had climbed higher, flattening the colors of everything. Heat shimmered off the rocks, making them look soft as melted wax. Every few steps, Jason wiped sweat from his forehead and squinted toward the horizon. The ground was pocked with old irrigation trenches, now dry and filled with weeds. He thought of his father as he walked, of the old man's stories about the valley before the drought, when the creek still ran and the wells were deep enough to keep a farm alive. The earth here, his father used to say, has veins like a body. You stop feeding them, they dry and die, and the land forgets what water is. Jason had laughed at that once. But now, looking across the dead fields, the words sounded like a warning. His father had also told him something else, something he had never understood. Don't dig too deep around here, son. Some things beneath this land don't want to be found. By mid-morning, he reached the edge of the riverbed. The sand was fine and pale, littered with fragments of stone and rusted scrap remnants of the old pumping stations that once dotted the valley. He crouched, scanning the ground. The hoofprints continued along the riverbed, but something else caught his eye. Long, narrow indentations running parallel to the cattle's path. At first, he thought they might be tire marks, but they were too straight, too deep, and spaced too close together. He followed them, curiosity overriding the fatigue creeping into his legs. The heat thickened as the sun climbed higher. A lone buzzard drifted overhead, its shadow gliding over the sand. Jason trudged forward, the rhythm of his boots crunching in time with his heartbeat. After a while, the trail curved toward a line of low hills, their slopes streaked with red and ochre. It was there, at the base of one of those hills, that something metallic flashed in the light. He stopped, crouched, and brushed the dust away. The object was round, smooth, cold to the touch despite the sun. He cleared more sand and realized it wasn't just a piece of scrap. It was the end of a pipe. It was enormous, 1/2 meter wide, its edge jagged where the soil had eroded. The metal was rough with rust, yet strangely intact. He knelt beside it, tracing the circumference with his hand. The pipe disappeared under the ground, the exposed end vanishing back into the sand. As he followed the curve of it, another segment appeared a few yards away, then another. They ran in a line, each connected by massive joints. It was no random debris. This was a system, a buried artery running beneath the valley. Jason followed the visible line for nearly 100 yards before it vanished beneath the hillside. He crouched again, listening. The air seemed to vibrate faintly, a sound so low he might have imagined it. He pressed his ear to the pipe and froze. A deep, distant hum pulsed through the metal, rhythmic and alive, as if something were moving far below. His stomach tightened. He pulled away, staring at the pipe. It was impossible. These irrigation lines had been abandoned decades ago when the government funding dried up. No one had maintained them since. And yet, the pipe felt warm in places, the seams polished clean as though someone had welded them recently. He glanced at the sun. It was already past noon. Sweat ran down his back, soaking his shirt. The air shimmered above the ground, like a thin veil of fire. He took a step back, his throat dry, his heart still pounding from that impossible hum. A strange unease pressed on him. The desert had a way of playing tricks on a man's senses, but this was something different. The sound wasn't in his head. It came from within the earth itself. He stood for a while longer, unsure whether to keep following or turn back. Then, somewhere beyond the next ridge, a metallic clang rang out sharp, brief, like the striking of iron against rock. He straightened, scanning the horizon. The sound echoed once and faded. The valley was empty. He saw no movement, only the shimmer of heat and the pale ripple of sand. He told himself it was just a fragment of old metal settling in the ground. But the feeling that he was being watched wouldn't leave him. By the time he turned back toward home, the sun was beginning to lower, painting the landscape in long shadows. His house was a small white speck far across the plain, almost swallowed by distance. He walked faster, his legs heavy, and his mind circling the same thought again and again. Someone had been there before him. Those pipes hadn't repaired themselves. The wind began to rise as he neared the house, carrying the dry scent of dust and iron. The door hinges creaked when he pushed inside, and the familiar dimness of his kitchen brought a strange comfort. He filled a glass from the jug on the counter and drank slowly, the water lukewarm but precious. Then he climbed the stairs to the attic, the boards groaning under his weight. The space smelled of cedar and thyme. Boxes lined the walls, some marked with his father's neat handwriting. He knelt by an old chest and opened it. Inside were papers, photographs, and a bundle of maps tied with twine. He spread one across the floor under the weak bulb overhead. The lines were faint but legible. An irrigation diagram from the 1970s. A bold number stood out near the bottom. Line 3, confidential. Next to it, the same name appeared again and again. Wayland Infrastructure. Jason frowned. He remembered the name from his childhood, though he couldn't place where he'd heard it. The company had run the government's water diversion projects during the drought years, promising to save the valley with underground pipelines. His father had worked briefly on one of their crews, though he rarely spoke of it afterward. Jason traced the path of Line 3 on the map. It ran directly beneath his land, stretching south toward the hills where he had found the pipes. At the bottom of the map, his father had written something in pencil, faded but still visible. Do not open. Private project. 1974. He sat back, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. His father had known about the pipes, had even marked them. But why hide it? He stared at the words, private project. The letters pressed deep into the page. What had Wayland been moving through those pipes, if not water? Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window pane. The sky beyond was a deep orange, the last light bleeding over the hills. Jason folded the map carefully, tucking it under his arm as he went back downstairs. He set it on the kitchen table and sat in silence, the old revolver beside him, the canteen empty. As night fell, the house seemed to breathe. The wood expanded and settled. The rafters gave soft cracks. But beneath those familiar noises, he thought he heard something else. A distant vibration, steady and low, like the heartbeat of the earth. He stepped outside once more. The stars had begun to appear, scattered faintly across the sky. The valley stretched below, dark and endless, a sea of shadows and forgotten history. He stood there a long time, listening. The wind brushed past, carrying with it that same faint hum, and for an instant, he thought he could feel it under his feet, a living pulse somewhere deep below. The cattle were still gone, but in that moment, he knew they were no longer what mattered. Whatever lay beneath the valley was awake again, and it was calling to him in the only language the desert still remembered, the sound of something moving through the bones of the earth. The following morning began with a weight in the air that Jason could not name. The sky had the color of tarnished copper, and the wind, which usually whispered through the dry reeds near the porch, had gone still. He ate in silence, barely tasting the stale bread, his mind circling around the sound he had heard the night before, the low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from the very ground beneath his house. The cattle were still gone, and though that loss should have been what troubled him most, something far older and more unsettling pressed against his thoughts. The image of that half-buried pipe, humming faintly under the sun, refused to leave him. By the time the first edge of light reached over the horizon, he had already strapped his canteen to his shoulder, packed a flashlight, and tied a length of rope to his belt. He meant to go back. The valley looked different under the morning haze. The sun had not yet burned through the thin mist, and the land seemed softer, almost deceptive in its calm. Jason followed the same path he had taken the previous day, past the cottonwoods and down into the riverbed. The sand still held the faint marks of the hoofprints, though they were blurring now under the drift of dust. What drew his attention, however, were the shallow parallel grooves running beside them, too uniform to be natural, too precise to be left by any animal. He crouched, running his hand along one of the grooves, and felt a coolness under the surface, as if the earth itself were breathing. As he walked, he began to notice other traces sections of metal barely visible where the sand had shifted overnight, and in one place, a length of exposed cable coiled like a snake across the ground. He touched it lightly. It was new, the plastic insulation intact, the copper gleaming faintly beneath a nick in the surface. Whoever had been maintaining the line had done so recently. The thought of someone else walking this same path in secret stirred both unease and a strange excitement in him. He wasn't alone in his discovery. The day grew hot quickly. Sweat gathered beneath his hat and ran down the back of his neck. The riverbed curved sharply between two low ridges, their slopes lined with fractured stones that gleamed in the sunlight. As he followed the bend, he caught sight of something large and angular jutting from the sand ahead. At first he thought it might be a derelict barn, but as he approached, the structure resolved into concrete and steel. An old pumping station, half buried, its roof collapsed on one side. A faded government sign hung crooked near the doorway, its paint almost completely peeled away. Only a few words remained legible. Sector D, authorized personnel only. Jason hesitated at the entrance. The air that drifted out of the darkness smelled faintly of oil and metal, mixed with something damp and earthy, like the scent of deep wells after rain. He turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The beam cut through clouds of dust, revealing the ghost of what once had been a control room. Rusted panels lined the walls, their dials frozen mid-measure. Piles of cables lay in tangled heaps across the floor. In the center of the room stood a large console. The glass over its gauges cracked, the surface coated in grime. But among the decay, one light still glowed, a faint, steady green. He moved closer, his boots scraping against the concrete. The small diode flickered once as his shadow crossed it, then steadied again. He brushed the dust aside and saw a row of switches and levers beneath it. On one side of the console, the nameplate still clung by a single screw. Wayland Infrastructure, Control Node C. He felt a chill despite the heat. The same name had been scrawled on the map he'd found in his father's attic. He knelt, prying open a small access panel under the console. Inside, a set of batteries had been wired together in a rough but deliberate fashion. Someone had replaced the original power source with portable cells, recent ones, not the kind that could have sat here for 40 years. A thin wire ran from the batteries up through a crack in the ceiling, and when he climbed onto a fallen beam to trace it, he saw that it led to a solar panel mounted on what remained of the roof. Someone had been here within the past year, perhaps even the past month. The light of the flashlight played across a section of the wall where faded writing had been stenciled in red. Pressure. 4.2. Active line. D3. He stepped back, following the direction of the arrow painted beside the words. A hatch, half hidden by debris, lay at the far end of the room. It was bolted shut, but the metal of the bolts shone silver in the dim light new, polished. His hands were trembling as he loosened them one by one. When the hatch finally gave way, a rush of cold, stale air poured out. Beneath it, a narrow stairway led downward, disappearing into darkness. He hesitated, his heart pounding. He had come this far out of curiosity, but standing before that stairway, the feeling that he was trespassing on something forbidden deepened into a quiet dread. Yet some part of him, the same stubborn streak that had kept him on this dying land long after most neighbors had sold their farms, urged him forward. He descended slowly, the beam of his flashlight catching on walls slick with condensation. The sound of his own breathing echoed faintly, blending with another noise, distant, rhythmic, mechanical. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a chamber supported by thick concrete columns. The temperature dropped sharply. Rows of pipes ran along the ceiling and walls, converging toward a single massive conduit that dominated the center of the floor. The steel was discolored, mottled with streaks of rust, but along one section he saw fresh weld marks, their edges still faintly golden. He crouched, touched one of the seams, and felt warmth radiating from it. A circular valve was set into the side of the conduit. Against his better judgment, he gripped the wheel and turned it. The metal resisted, groaned, and then shifted with a hiss. A narrow vent opened, releasing a stream of vapor. The smell that filled the air was sharp and chemical, burning the back of his throat. He stumbled back, Coughing, the vapor settled into the light, shimmering silver before fading into nothing. Where it touched the concrete floor, a pale residue bloomed like frost before evaporating. It wasn't water, wasn't oil. Whatever it was, it didn't belong in the open air. Jason stared at the valve for a long moment, fighting the impulse to close it again. He leaned closer, reading the faint lettering etched beside it. Meridian Project. Transfer Unit. The words matched those on the crumbling map in his attic. His father had known about this, had worked for the people who built it. He remembered the tired look in the old man's eyes whenever the drought was mentioned, the way he would change the subject when Jason asked why the wells had really been sealed. The hum in the room deepened, vibrating through the floor. He replaced the valve handle carefully and stepped back. His flashlight caught another line of text, almost invisible on the far wall. Authorized use terminated. 1979. Yet the gauges on the console beside the pipes flickered faintly, numbers shifting. The system was not dead. Someone had reawakened it. He backed away, his pulse hammering in his ears. As he climbed the stairs, the light of the flashlight wavered, casting his shadow long and distorted across the walls. At the top, he sealed the hatch again and stumbled outside. The sun had sunk lower, staining the horizon a deep, burning red. The wind had risen at last, carrying with it the dry tang of metal. He felt the vibration under his boots, faint but unmistakable, like the echo of distant thunder coming from beneath the sand. He made his way home as the first gusts of a storm began to sweep across the valley. Dust whirled through the air, turning the world into a haze of gold and brown. His mind replayed every image, the warm seams of metal, the ghostly vapor, the steady green light that refused to die. When he reached the house, darkness had already fallen, and the first drops of rain struck the roof with hollow taps. Inside, he lit the lamp and sat at the table, opening his notebook. His handwriting came shaky at first, but steadied as he wrote. Pipes still active. Liquid inside, not water. Pressure maintained by unknown source. Possible connection to Wayland's Meridian Project. He paused, glancing toward the window. The glass rattled in the wind, and for a brief second, he thought he saw a flicker of light in the distance, a pulse like a lantern being raised and lowered beyond the hills. He rubbed his eyes, uncertain if it was lightning or something else. He read over his notes again, the ink blurring slightly from a drop of rain that had found its way through the cracked frame. He underlined one phrase. Someone is still down there. The thought settled in his chest like a weight. The valley had long been silent, abandoned by industry and forgotten by the state. Yet beneath its barren surface, something persisted. Something man-made and alive. The storm gathered strength outside. Lightning flashed, illuminating the plains in stark silver for a heartbeat. And Jason thought he saw, just for that instant, a column of vapor rising where the hills began. He shut his notebook and rose from the table. His clothes were damp with sweat and rain, his hands trembling slightly. He knew sleep would not come. All night the wind roared around the house, shaking the shutters. Between the crashes of thunder, he could hear the same deep resonance as before, a low pulse from the ground that no storm could explain. Each time it came, it seemed stronger, closer, as though the earth itself were alive and stirring. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the rain carve thin rivers through the dust, and when the first faint light touched the sky, he knew what he had to do. He would go back. He would find where the pipes led. Whatever his father had tried to bury, whatever secret had been left beneath this land, it was awake again. And Jason Wells, the last farmer of a dying valley, would be the one to uncover what the earth had been holding in its silent heart. When the storm finally broke and the sky cleared, the valley lay washed and pale, its surface glimmering under the hesitant light of dawn. Pools of muddy water filled the cracks between the stones, and steam rose faintly from the cooling ground. Jason Wells stood on his porch, the taste of sleeplessness thick in his mouth. The night had left him hollow, yet the resolve that had taken root in him would not fade. He could no longer turn away from what he had found beneath the hills. There were too many signs, too many unanswered questions left behind by his father and the company that had vanished like ghosts in the wind. The storm had not quieted the hum that haunted the valley. It had made it clearer, deeper, as though the rain had washed away the distance between him and the thing moving under the land. He packed slowly, methodically. The rope, the flashlight, the revolver, a fresh notebook, and a coil of wire went into his canvas bag. He filled his canteen again and tied it to his belt. The sun was still low when he started out, and the air held the sharp scent of wet sand. The storm had stripped the surface bare, revealing the outlines of the buried pipes as if the earth itself wanted them seen. He followed their path, each section of metal glinting like a thread of bone through the mud. The landscape stretched silent and endless before him, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling far overhead. The ground grew firmer as he approached the hills. Near the base of the tallest ridge, where he had once seen the faint wisp of vapor rising, he found what he was looking for: a round patch of exposed metal half hidden under a drift of gravel. Kneeling, he brushed the stones aside and uncovered a large iron hatch embedded in the ground. It bore the same insignia he had seen inside the pumping station: Wayland Infrastructure, Line D. A heavy padlock sealed it shut. The lock gleamed in the sun, new and unweathered. Someone had been here recently, perhaps only days ago. He set down his bag and studied it. There was no keyhole visible, just a solid mechanism clamped around a steel bar. He drew the crowbar from his pack and wedged it into the gap. The first attempt yielded nothing but the screech of bending metal. He tried again, sweat sliding into his eyes. On the third strike, the lock snapped with a sharp crack. For a moment, he simply crouched there, breathing hard, listening to the faint echo that seemed to roll up from below, as if the valley were holding its breath. Then he grasped the edge of the hatch and pulled. The hinges groaned, releasing a rush of stale, cold air. Below lay a shaft lined with iron rungs descending into darkness. Jason tied the rope around one of the nearby rocks and tested its hold, then fixed his flashlight to his belt and began to climb down. The metal was slick beneath his gloves, the air growing cooler with each rung. After what felt like an eternity, his boots touched solid ground. He turned, raising the light. The beam fell across a wide tunnel stretching both directions, its walls perfectly smooth, poured concrete darkened with moisture. Along one side ran 3 massive pipes, each the size of a man's torso, their surfaces gleaming faintly under the film of condensation. The sound down here was unlike anything above, an unbroken, low vibration that seemed to pass through his chest rather than his ears. He walked slowly, one hand trailing the cold wall. Every few steps, the flashlight caught flashes of paint, warning symbols, numbers, and faded instructions. The air smelled faintly metallic, tinged with ozone. He followed the tunnel for several minutes before the space widened into what could only be described as a subterranean chamber. The walls arched high overhead, supported by thick columns. The pipes converged here, merging into an immense steel cylinder that dominated the center of the room. Jason's light swept over the markings, stenciled along its side: Project Meridian, Subsurface Containment Unit. Beneath the words, someone had spray-painted newer letters in hurried strokes. Keep it running. He approached slowly, the beam trembling in his hand. The surface of the tank pulsed faintly, as though something inside were moving. Gauges flickered on a nearby console, their needles trembling between numbers. A small monitor glowed dimly with green light, lines of data streaming across the screen in a language he didn't understand. The machine was alive, or at least still breathing. Jason set down his pack and brushed away dust from a nearby table. There were footprints in the grime boots, heavier than his own, leading toward a side passage. He crouched and examined them. The prints were recent, the edges crisp. Someone had been here, maybe still was. He followed the tracks through a doorway into a smaller chamber lined with shelves. It looked like a maintenance room. Tools scattered, crates stacked against the walls, a cot folded neatly in one corner. On the cot lay a rucksack, a half-empty canteen, and a small notebook. He opened it cautiously. Inside were columns of numbers and brief notes, written in hurried script. Pressure stable. Intake adjusted. Core temperature holding. The last entry was dated only 2 weeks ago. He froze at the sound of movement. Somewhere behind him, a faint clang echoed through the tunnel. He turned off his flashlight and held his breath. The sound came again, closer now, the steady rhythm of boots on metal. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted by the pale glow from the main chamber. The man was tall, dressed in a gray jumpsuit smeared with grease and dust, his face half covered by a respirator. In one hand, he held a lantern that cast unsteady light against the walls. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice low, roughened by years underground. Jason didn't move. "I followed the pipes," he answered finally. "I had to know what they were." The man lowered the lantern slightly. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of machinery filled the space between them. Then the stranger sighed, the sound heavy and tired. "I suppose it was only a matter of time before someone came looking. People always come back when the land starts to die." He stepped forward into the light. His hair was streaked with gray, his eyes deep-set and rimmed with exhaustion. There was something haunted in his expression, but not unkind. "What is this place?" Jason asked. The man looked past him toward the main chamber, toward the massive tank. "A mistake," he said quietly, "and a responsibility." He motioned for Jason to follow and led him back to the central hall. The air seemed thicker here, vibrating with the low thrum of the pumps. The man stopped before the console, resting his hand on the side of the tank as though feeling for its pulse. "You know the droughts," he said. "Everyone remembers the droughts. The government promised water, so Wayland built these lines, miles of them. But the wells they drilled ran dry. They started looking for something else to move through the pipes, something that would bring money instead of water." Jason stared at the man. What did they find? "Toxins," the man said simply. "Industrial runoff, waste from the plants up north. They were paid to dispose of it quietly. So they pumped it here, under the farms, under the rivers. They said the containment units would last forever. But forever's shorter than you think." Jason felt a coldness creep through him. "And now?" "Now the seals are failing," the man said. "The pumps keep the pressure stable. If they stop, the liquid will rise through the old wells. The soil's brittle. It would spread for miles. That's why I stayed. Someone had to keep it alive long enough for the world to forget it existed." He turned toward Jason, his eyes steady. "You can't tell anyone. They'll dig it up, try to fix it, make it worse. The safest thing is to leave it buried. Let it die slowly, the way it was meant to." Jason wanted to argue, to shout that this couldn't stay hidden, that people had a right to know. But when he looked around the chamber, at the age of the walls, the rusting pipes, the faint tremor of the machine that had outlived its creators, he felt the futility of words. The man was right. Some truths could not be unearthed without poisoning everything around them. A deep vibration shuddered through the floor, the lights flickering. The man moved quickly to the console, adjusting a valve. "Pressure spike," he muttered. "It's stabilizing. You should go." Jason hesitated, glancing once more at the great steel cylinder, its surface breathing in slow, heavy rhythm. "What happens when you can't keep it running anymore?" he asked. The man gave a weary smile. "Then the earth will take it back. That's what it does. It buries our mistakes, layer by layer, until even the bones forget." He said nothing more. Jason turned and walked back through the tunnel, the echo of the man's words following him like a shadow. The climb up the ladder seemed longer this time, the air above heavier. When he pushed the hatch open, the sunlight struck his face with blinding force. He pulled himself onto the surface, gasping as though surfacing from deep water. The valley stretched before him, silent and golden once more. Nothing moved but the wind rippling through the grass. He stood for a long time beside the open hatch. Then he bent, gathered the scattered stones, and began to cover it again. By the time he finished, the iron door was hidden beneath a smooth layer of earth. From his bag, he took 2 pieces of wood, tied them together into the shape of a cross, and pressed it into the soil. It was not a grave, though it felt like one. When he returned home, the sun was setting behind the hills. The light turned the windows of the house to mirrors, reflecting the emptiness of the land. Inside, he lit the lamp and opened his notebook. His hands hovered over the page, then lowered the pen. He wrote only 1 sentence. "Not all things buried should be found." He closed the book and sat in the stillness, listening. The wind had died again, but from somewhere deep beneath his feet came the faintest whisper, a low, steady hum that no longer frightened him. He stepped out onto the porch as darkness fell. The sky was vast and clear, scattered with stars. The land stretched quiet and infinite to the horizon. Jason Wells closed his eyes and listened to the hum until it faded into the heartbeat of the world. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Not because the valley had been saved, but because he finally understood that some forms of ruin were older and quieter than men could ever mend. The earth was not dead. It was holding its secrets close, letting them breathe beneath the sand, waiting for time to swallow them whole. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next ones. Watch more stories like this right here, and share this video with someone who loves discovering hidden truths beneath ordinary lives.